Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Tim Winton Lecture Theatre in Curtin University. My name's Brian Evans. I'm Professor in the Department of Petroleum Engineering, and I'll be your MC for the duration this evening. I am delighted to welcome you all to the RISC Conversation Series seminar. And before I start, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of this land on which we meet this evening, the Nyunga people of WA, and pay respect to the elders past and present. Before proceedings get underway, please, will you now turn off your mobile phones? Okay, you've been, like I have been, handed a small keypad as you enter the room. This will be used for voting on questions that will be put to you with an immediate answer, hopefully, might come up there. To turn your keypad on, please press and hold the login button on the bottom left of the keypad for at least 5 seconds. You should see a light appear which indicates your keypad is on. The light will not remain on, but will be displayed each time you vote on an answer. May I ask that you do not select an answer until the question has been asked? So that the results remain true. Reflection. If you don't wish to answer, don't bother pressing. Okay. This is the second of 4 such events in the RISC Conversation Series, which was launched earlier this year. RISC is, of course, a consultancy and a company in the oil and gas sector. The majority of its employees are well regarded because they have spent decades. They have decades of experience individually within the oil and gas sector. So we take on board quite seriously whatever RISC has to say with regard to the future of the oil and gas business. So we welcome this evening Martin Wilkes from RISC. Martin, if you'd like to come up here. Yes, please. Martin has over 25 years' experience in international oil and gas industry encompassing the upstream oil and gas sector, LNG and gas technology development with both large and small companies. Prior to joining RISC, Martin had international roles with Shell and Woodside. His experience includes business leadership, training and project development. Martin holds a Master of Engineering degree in Chemical and Process Engineering from University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Problem is they don't have a very good football team. He is a chartered chemical engineer, probably the reason he left Newcastle upon Tyne. He is a chartered chemical engineer and a member of the Institute of Chemical Engineers. He is also a member of the Society of Petroleum Engineering and a chartered environmentalist. Please welcome Martin Wilkes.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everybody for that warm welcome. You'll get to know a bit more about me, thanks for that lovely introduction. Actually, I don't come from Newcastle, you can tell by the accent, or those English people amongst you would be able to tell that. I come from somewhere with an even worse football team, which is just south of Birmingham. After graduating from Newcastle University, I actually decided I should go and see the world. And I was fortunate enough that Shell gave me that opportunity. And I joined them, worked in Holland, Africa, came over here in the late 90s, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And I met my wife, who is Australian. So I'm now dual national. My kids are dual nationals. And I think England and the UK is a lovely place to visit. With that, I'll start. You've heard a bit about me. I'm here to just give you a sort of overview of the LNG industry, both from a historical perspective, where things are now, and Australia's a really interesting place at the moment in regards to LNG, and where it might go in the future. Now, we often say to people in the industry and around RISC that we're not forecasters, we're not market analysts. And so, given what's happened in the markets over the last few days, I would be very foolish to predict what might happen in the next few years. So just bear that in mind. This is just a view. I can almost guarantee you one thing, and that's that it will be wrong. But we'll see where that goes later on. Okay, so another thing that we do in nearly all industry presentations is we put disclaimers up and say, don't base any of your investment decisions on what I'm about to tell you. Again, given what's happened over the past couple of days, I think that's very wise. The difference with this disclaimer, and I do notice there's a couple of my colleagues in the room here, is that not all the views here are necessarily shared by everybody at RISC. Some of them are just mine. And maybe at the end of the evening we can have a discussion on what's mine and what's RISC's, and what is generally held to be a truth in the industry. So, you know a bit about me. I would actually like to get to know a bit about you before I go much further with this discussion. So here's the first of the questions, and we'll see if this technology works. I've been assured it does. So if you could respond to those questions. Now, there are, I think, 9 or 10 buttons on your clicker. If you press anything bigger than 4, it's not going to work. So 1 to 4, please, and we'll see where we go. Ooh. That's pretty good. I'm not sure whether it's interactive or not. So we've stopped at 62 responses, and I can see from that, as I was hoping, most people are not associated with RISC. So that's good. And we've got a majority of students here, which hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm not actually sure how long I'm going to talk for, so we'll see as we go along. Okay, some more questions. What do you think of when you think of the oil and gas industry? And I know there are some people from the oil and gas industry here, so I'm expecting some favourable responses. But if you're not in favour of the oil and gas industry, that's fine. I'm going to ask this question again at the end, and maybe we'll see if I've managed to change anybody's minds. So 70 responses there. Oh, good. I have a friendly audience. That's great. And you're laughing as well. That's even better. Okay, I can see that there's some neutrals and some unfavourables. Those are the people I'm actually hoping to change your mind. If I change any of your minds, if you're favourable at the moment and you come out going, no, I'm not going to do that, then I apologise in advance. But hopefully that's not going to happen. And then a bit more specific, Western Australia. It's quite a strong industry in Western Australia. So do you have a different view about the industry as it appears to you in WA than you do of the industry in general? You'll be able to put these away in a minute, by the way. I'm not going to carry this on for the whole night. Okay, so again about 70, and okay, so slightly skewed towards a more favourable view of the industry in WA. And we'll come back to that maybe later on as well. In fact, I'm not sure whether we will or not, to be honest. And then finally, we do have a majority of students here. And those who aren't actually working in the industry, because we've got some alumni as well. What are you thinking? RISC people, you can put your clicker away for this. I don't need a response from you. You're already working there. And I see some other people from a few oil companies as well. So, again, good. I'm pleased about that. I can go home now. That's it. So I've finished, thanks, that's it, yeah. No, we'll just talk through a few things. Finally, and yeah, again, RISC people don't answer this, but for those, the rest of you, have you heard of RISC before? And again, we're up at around 70 responses. Okay, so less than half. Hopefully we can spread the word. That's good. Thank you for that. Now I know a bit more about you, and we can get on to the subject, which is about liquefied natural gas. So what is liquefied natural gas? Well, actually, to you and me, it's the same as the stuff that you turn on to do your cooking with. It's just natural gas. Why is it liquefied? Well, it's liquefied because it's easier to transport over long distances. So looking at these slides here, you see there's a group of resource, what would I say there? Group of countries that are resource positive. They have a lot of resources available to them, particularly oil and gas, so Middle East, Malaysia, Australia, and a group of resource poor countries. Japan and South Korea in particular have pretty much no natural resources, and so they're importing anything. Importing oil to Japan was basically what was done historically. When gas came along and LNG became viable, it became an option for them that was potentially cheaper. And we'll talk about why LNG has been historically linked to oil pricing later on as well. And it's mainly this issue of how do we get cheap energy into the country? So these guys here are all looking for energy, and these guys here are able to supply it. Now, supplying gas over distances of 3, 4, 5,000 nautical miles is very difficult. And that's where LNG comes in, because you liquefy it, you transport it as a liquid, as a normal cargo. I say a normal cargo, it is slightly different, because to keep it liquid at room condition or at atmospheric conditions, you need to cool it down to minus 161 degrees centigrade. So basically what happens in the LNG industry is we take natural gas out of the ground and we cool it down using a big fridge-like machine or series of machines and turn it into liquid natural gas. And then we hold it at minus 161 degrees and transport it wherever it wants to go. And at the other end, it just gets warmed back up again and used like normal natural gas. So that's basically the story. Unfortunately, when you're trying to liquefy natural gas and you're trying to go down to minus 160 degrees, a lot of things freeze well before you get there. Water freezes before you get there. CO2 freezes before you get there. And lots of heavy hydrocarbons, so things, the sorts of hydrocarbons that you find in petrol and diesel, they all freeze before you get to minus 160. And one thing as a chemical engineer I can tell you is solids don't flow very easily, so they tend to bung up machines and cause problems. So the thing you do with LNG is you make sure that all you've got left is basically methane and a little bit of ethane in it, so the light hydrocarbons that aren't going to freeze, and you get rid of everything else. So the terminology is slightly wrong. It's not natural gas. It's liquefied processed natural gas. Okay, but we call it LNG, and I'll stick with that. This picture shows where... Oh, have I got? Would help if I didn't put my finger over the laser. This shows the major LNG export countries in 2014. As you can see, Qatar is by far the largest producer, has been for the last 7 to 10 years. Followed by Malaysia. Australia's there sitting in bronze medal position. As of earlier this year, we are already in second position because QC LNG started up production at the beginning of this year. And so in 2015, we'll produce somewhere between 30 and 40 million tonnes of LNG. And that's going to change further. So in the next 4 years, Australia will overtake Qatar as the largest producer of LNG. And you're going to see the USA coming up here as a major exporter of LNG. And in the next 5 to 10 years, the USA may well become the #1 exporter of LNG. It also may not, but it's a possibility. At the same time, you're going to see some of these countries that are currently exporters, and I'm looking at Malaysia and Indonesia here, they're going to become net importers of LNG because their resources are basically running out. So Indonesia and Malaysia are both already importers of LNG as well as being exporters. That balance is going to shift, and they're going to require more and more energy imports in the form of LNG. And again, that's something to bear in mind. We'll come back to that a bit later on. On the importer side, Japan and South Korea are the major importers. Interestingly enough, in the last decade, everyone thought that the USA was going to be the second largest importer of LNG. And the shale gas revolution, which we'll touch briefly on later on, has changed that around dramatically, and it's also had a significant impact on markets around the world. South Korea, or Japan, we anticipate will probably not grow its LNG consumption anymore. It may actually retract a bit as they turn on the nuclear energy again in Japan. You may find that LNG consumption decreases a bit. South Korea seems to have plateaued out. Any growth there will be small. But these countries down here, China, India, Taiwan, are growing at quite a phenomenal rate. Even given the slowdown in China, its LNG consumption is going up quite significantly. So there's going to be some changes. And in particular, we anticipate that there will be further growth in the LNG market. And I'll come back to that later on. So how does Australia stand in amongst that? And I think it's worthwhile going on a bit of a tour of Australia here. So we have 4 major regions, 3 offshore, the Carnarvon Basin, Browse Basin, Bonaparte Basin, and 1 onshore, which is the coal seam gas or coal bed methane, depending on which country you live in, which is the 3 East Coast LNG plants at the moment. The story starts for Australia really on the Northwest Shelf, so I'm going to look at the Carnarvon Basin first. And the picture, although I'm just about to show you where all the projects are, but that sort of picture shows the history of LNG in Australia for the last 40 to 50 years. So first up we have the Northwest Shelf Venture, which is the Woodside-led operation, with its gas fields northwest of Karratha and the big LNG plant just north of Karratha. The second one on stream was Pluto, which is pretty much next door to the Northwest Shelf Venture. Gorgon, the massive Gorgon fields here, which is being built on Barrow Island at the moment. And Wheatstone, which sort of crosses across everything. And therein lies part of the story that it's worth talking about, because how did we end up with what, to me, coming from Birmingham, looks like Spaghetti Junction? I don't know if any of you know Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham. It's a motorway crossing. The M6 and the M5 and the M something or other joined together, yeah, and they just go all over the place. We ended up with a picture that looks a bit like that with how our LNG system is working. And a lot of that's historical. And I nearly forgot Scarborough, which is out there as a potential floating LNG, or may also come back to somewhere around Ashburton or even part of the Wheatstone LNG project. So historically, well, the oil and gas industry has been around a long time in WA. I think there are some people in the room who were born before 1963. I'm not one of them, by the way. So this is before my time as well. But in 1963, Woodside was awarded 370,000 square kilometres of acreage on the Carnarvon around the Northwest Shelf. Now, I'm fortunate enough to work at RISC, and our chairman is Richard Court, who is an ex-premier of WA. He's also the son of Sir Charles Court, and I noticed you've got the walkway, Sir Charles Court walkway here, who is another premier of WA. And he was around in the 1980s when things really got going. And Richard remembers him being asked a question as to how the hell did one company get so much acreage in the Northwest Shelf? Apparently the answer was really simple. They were the only ones that applied. So no one knew at the time what riches lay beneath the ocean out there, except for maybe some very clever explorationists in Woodside who really knew what they were talking about. Who knows? Who knows why they got that? Anyway, they did get the acreage. North Rankin was found in the early 70s, along with Tarosa, which is not actually here, it's in the Browse Basin, and we'll see that on the map next up, because that form was part of the Browse LNG project. And then lots of study work. These things take a long time. This is just to give you an impression of the time it takes to get some of these industries working and moving. So in the 1980s, and this was, I guess, the real key driver for the start of the industry, the WA government agreed to basically underwrite the domestic gas system. They built the DBNGP, which is the gas supply pipeline that supplies all the gas down to Perth and down to Bunbury, and agreed to take the gas from the North West Shelf Venture on a take-or-pay contract. It cost them about $1 billion to build that pipeline under Sir Charles Court. It was his government at the time. His son later sold it for about $2 billion, so the government made a tidy profit on that pipeline. And domestic gas started. At around about the same time, the Japanese came in, Japanese buyers of LNG, and agreed to underwrite the LNG projects. Now, the methodology or their rationale behind that was Japan was energy hungry. The alternative was oil. So what they did was they created a pricing mechanism that said, we want to basically guarantee that our natural gas is always going to be slightly cheaper than oil. And that is the sort of history of oil linking. It had happened previously in other countries, and it continued in Australia with this view of, if we can get gas in and it's cheaper than oil, it's a good thing for Japan. So that's where that came from, that oil linkage that you may have heard a bit about in the press over the last few years. And in 1989, LNG 1 started. There's now 5 trains at the North West Shelf. So you see, it's been supplying LNG to Japan for 20-something years, and it's continuing. Won't go through all of this. Other things that are interesting, I think, is that Gorgon was discovered back in the very early 80s, and the oil and gas industry has some humour, I think. Those of you who know your Greek mythology might recognise that Perseus slayed the Gorgon. The Perseus field was found quite by accident right next door to North Rankin. In fact, the very first Perseus well is still called a North Rankin. It's North Rankin 22, I think, as a well. And then they realised it was actually in a different field. So they found it and decided, well, that might actually set Gorgon back a bit, which apparently it did. So that was why it was called that, or at least the rumour is that that's why it was called Perseus. Further on, North West Shelf expansion, Pluto, and Gorgon taking its final investment decision, and more recently, all the CSG and the 7 projects that were FID'd or sanctioned in the 2010-2011 period. A bit more about me. In the intervening period about here, this is when I arrived in Australia, because once Perseus and Goodwin had started up, apparently Train 4 and Train 5 was a slam dunk. So I came in as part of a vanguard of people to get Train 4 and Train 5 sanctioned and up and running. I left again in 2003, having married my wife, went to Holland and back with Shell and did some training. I headed up their process engineering training for a couple of years before the train had started up. So in that intervening period, Train 4 eventually got going in 2004 and Train 5 in 2008. And a lot of that is to do with getting the right market conditions, getting the right commercial agreements in place, as well as the technical development. Enough of history. We'll just do a quick fly around the rest of the Australian industry. This is the Browse Basin, and in the Browse Basin, there isn't anything there at the moment, but we have the Prelude FLNG vessel. Again, I'll come back and talk briefly about where I think FLNG is going in the future. We have the Ichthys plant. So Prelude is going to be the largest floating vessel on the planet. And Ichthys, right next door to it, are building the longest subsea pipeline in the southern hemisphere. So two world firsts, very close to each other. And then we also have the Browse LNG development, which has been in and out the press quite a lot. It was originally mooted as a traditional land-based LNG somewhere north of Broome, about here, James Price Point. Has been in the news over the last few years a lot. The venture decided it wasn't commercial. There was also a lot of activism against that particular site. And now they're looking at FLNG, and 2 or 3 vessels is what they're proposing that it may end up as. Not sanctioned. Ichthys and Prelude obviously are in the construction phase and going ahead. Elsewhere, moving further around, we have Bayu-Undan and Darwin LNG, which started up in 2004. We've got the pipeline coming in from Ichthys and the Ichthys plant being built in Darwin. And then we have a number of other potential projects there. Bonaparte, which has been looked at on numerous occasions, either as a backfill to Darwin or more recently as a standalone FLNG. And I think the venture is still looking at it as a standalone floating development, albeit somewhat different. We have Abadi. Abadi is actually in Indonesian waters, but it's always appears on the map, so it's worthwhile mentioning it. It's mooted as a Prelude lookalike. And Sunrise, which may or may not be FLNG. We know that the Timor government would like it to be a land-based plant on Timor. And in addition, you have a couple of other fields out there, which have been, Barossa Caldita has been recently appraised, and our understanding is that that's looking like a potential candidate for backfill through the Bayu-Undan to Darwin LNG facilities. So a fair bit of LNG and potential LNG projects out there. And finally, we have the CSG to LNG projects on the East Coast. So they are actually onshore plants, onshore fields. The CSG industry is quite different. It's relatively shallow drilling. They need a lot of wells, and they will continue to need a lot of wells through their life cycle. So this gives you an idea of where those fields are in relation to the plants. And QCLNG, as we know, has actually started up, so that should be in production now rather than under construction. And we've got APLNG and GLNG starting up relatively soon as well. Just to give you a visual on these things, about 2 or 3 years ago, this slide is actually from a presentation from, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, where all we had to go on was their environmental impact submissions. And we sort of looked at these and said, well, this is what they're saying. This is what they're saying they're going to build. It's going to look something like that. This is a more recent photo of what those plants actually look like from Google Earth. And as you can see, they're pretty much kept within their environmental impact statements. I think the one thing I noticed was APLNG have moved their jetty from here to here, QCLNG have moved their jetty a bit further south. And this area has been reclaimed land, and it's from their dredging program to allow the ships to get into berth at these projects. So that's what the industry looks like. Here's an overview of those projects and their timelines. Obviously, the 4 that are now operational are there. The ones that have been sanctioned and are ongoing, there's no stopping those now. It's a bit like jumping on a train. The train's left the station. These things are going to get delivered now. The question is when and at what cost. Now, we know that some of them have been delayed. We anticipate that APLNG and GLNG will start up this year. Gorgon, not so sure. It's looking like it will probably slip into 2016 and may have further knock-on impacts on the later trains. Wheatstone and Ichthys, again, there's been some noises in the press recently that they may be suffering delays in terms of progress. But nevertheless, 30 million tonnes online now and another 50 coming. So obviously Qatar's got a moratorium on further building of LNG projects at the moment. So by the time these things come online, Australia will be number one in terms of export. The future, well, given market conditions and given what's going on in the world, a lot of these projects have missed their target sanction dates. And I suspect that that will continue. I think there's a need now for people to reanalyse what's going on, reanalyse the cost involved with the projects, and to maybe think about different ways of doing it. And that's where some of you guys might come in, because we need ingenious people. I love the French word for engineer, ingénieur. Ingenuity is what's going to be required. So what we're looking for in the future is to think of different ways of doing it to make it cheaper. I much prefer to be an engineer than an engineer, but never mind. And also, the USA is coming. Now, I think I mentioned right at the beginning that even as recently as 2007, I can point you to presentations from major companies that were saying that America was going to be the second largest importer of gas in the world. So 7 years on, this is what's actually happening. The USA has got over 50 million tonnes of sanctioned projects. So those projects are definitely going ahead. They've pushed the button, so this is the juggernaut story again. They are going to be producing LNG and exporting. There's another 40-odd million tonnes in waiting. As you see, some of those have missed their target sanction dates as well. And like the Australian projects, they are going to go through a recycle process and can we do this? Are we sure we can do this in the conditions of today and what we think the future will hold? But on top of that, there's proposals and plans out there for way more. Now, I always think, are there any Americans in the audience? Okay, well, I always think the Americans sometimes overreact to these things. So not all of these projects are going to get done. But you can bet your bottom dollar that there will be quite a few of them being done. So I wouldn't be surprised if America does become the number one exporter in, say, the next 6 to 10 years. But don't hold me to that. Back to Australia, and then what have the papers been saying? And you may recognise some of this. Not all of it's completely current. But it's basically been a story of Australia's high cost, Australia's productivity is poor, we can't afford to do business in Australia, we need to do things differently. I'm not sure I agree with this, and we'll see why in a minute, but back on your clickers. So, what we do know is that people have been comparing projects for a number of years, and intrinsically the first Australian project that they've been comparing with is Gorgon, and the first US project is a project called Sabine Pass. So I'm not going to tell you anything more about them. Is it fair? Is that a fair comparison? Click away. You see, I told you I'd keep you awake. How many have we got? Okay, well, you've obviously been reading the papers because I think it's not a fair comparison, and the reasons are multiple. I'm not going to go through those. I'll pick on a couple. First of all, Gorgon is located on an island and it's on a nature reserve, and there's a whole heap of issues that they are dealing with as a result of that. Secondly, it has quite a high CO2 content, and that means additional processing and additional cleaning of the gas. And thirdly, they are actually employing a carbon capture and storage technology, which adds additional cost and burden. Fourthly, because I like Monty Python and they always do things additional to that, they've got a domestic gas plant as well. So they're actually obligated to provide gas into our system here so that we can keep turning the gas on and using our heaters and cookers. So I don't think that is a very fair comparison. Fortunately, we have, and this is, I've made a bit of a leading question here. So fortunately, we now have more projects to compare with. And these are two, QC LNG, which is just finished, and Corpus Christi, which is a US greenfield project. So same question. Is that a fair comparison? I can hear some movement, so I must be keeping everyone awake. Okay, yes, there's still a few no's. I think it's a fairer comparison, let's put it this way. There are issues around the US and tax regimes and the business models are very different, okay? But intrinsically, it's not a bad comparison. I mean, they're both in sheltered water. Okay, Curtis Island doesn't have a road system and Corpus Christi does. It's also got probably better access to skilled workforce than you might have at Gladstone. But intrinsically not that unfair. And I think that's borne out by those figures there, which say that QC LNG is costing a shade under $20 billion. Now, that includes all the upstream elements of QC LNG as well, which Corpus Christi doesn't have because they buy the gas, or they actually toll the gas through they're going to toll the gas through their system. But somebody will be buying the gas from the American grid in order to process through that plant. So the business model is very different. But when you take out the upstream component of QC LNG, you get to quite a similar figure. And bear in mind, QC LNG was built during this period of apparently poor productivity and high-cost labour in Australia. It was also built at a time of parity or above parity between the Australian dollar and the US dollar, and yet it's cost a fairly equivalent amount to what they're expecting that Corpus Christi will cost. And so I don't necessarily hold the belief that Australia is a high-cost environment and has priced itself out of the market, particularly not when you consider now that the Aussie dollar is at 70 cents to the US dollar, rather than, I think it was a high of about $1.10. And there's a lot of similarities there. Incidentally, as an aside as well, Cheniere, who are building both the Sabine Pass and the Corpus Christi projects, have already been out in the press saying that they are seeing cost pressures as a result of Louisiana now having the lowest unemployment rate in the world. I think they're at 3% or something like that, which is where WA was 4 or 5 years ago. So the sort of pressures that we saw in Australia are not unique to Australia. They're going to be seen in the US and other countries as well if they're going to try and do multiple LNG projects at the same time. So when you start looking at what is it about cost of supply, how does that work, there's other things that matter apart from the upfront cost and the running cost of the projects. Things like distance. Now obviously here, in terms of distance into Japan and China, Australia has an advantage. It's somewhere between a third and half the distance of the US, even if the US is going through the Panama Canal. They can't do that at the moment, by the way. They've got to wait until the expansion happens, and then the bigger LNG ships will be able to traverse the Panama Canal. And the other aspect that is often forgotten when people talk about LNG projects is that they're not all the same. Some of them have liquids and some of them don't. And so this graph is just an indication of the impact that liquids can have. It can be almost like having another LNG train sat alongside it in terms of the revenue it generates for you. So when you put that in the mix, and I'm not going to go through all these bits and pieces, because apart from anything else, I will put you to sleep if I try and describe all this. But when you put that in the mix, and it depends on how you look at it, you can cut and dice this lots of ways. But you can see that Australia, whilst being potentially higher cost against a US project which is buying Henry Hub gas at a low price, it's certainly going to be competitive against a greenfield US project which has to buy Henry Hub at a slightly higher price. Now currently, I think Henry Hub is just a shade under that $3. Historically though, it hasn't been that for a long time. And if you apply the sort of pricing mechanisms that we're seeing, both the oil index linking and the Henry Hub index linking that we see historically, you see that actually Henry Hub has been more expensive gas as a gas supplier to Japan for longer than it has been cheaper. And recently, the oil price crash and the Henry Hub price lowering has taken away any differential that you might see between the two at the moment. What happens in the future? Anybody's guess. This graph, because I think, do we hand out this presentation pack afterwards? Is that what happens? Yeah, we can do. Just in case you want to have a look at it afterwards, the way to read this is Henry Hub on the left-hand side. So let's say it was at $4. You come across to where it hits the blue line, and that is roughly an equivalent price into Japan of $10. $10 into Japan is roughly equivalent to, say, $65 oil price on the other one. So Henry Hub at $4 is roughly equivalent to a $65 oil index pricing, and vice versa. Okay, very quickly on to the LNG market and where things are going. And I'm sort of running out of time here. I didn't think I'd take this long, so we'll see where we go. Global LNG plateaued a little bit over the last few years. That's partly because there's only been a few projects coming on stream. Most of the projects that are now sanctioned have sold their gas already, so there will be growth here. Interestingly, though, the Asia-Pacific region hasn't plateaued. It's been going up, and that's been driven by China and India and South Korea, and of course Japan more recently. I also wanted to show the short-term and spot market, which has increased much more significantly as a part of the industry. And I think that's important, particularly for the future of floating LNG, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So this growth over the past 15 years has been about 7% per annum, both in terms of global trade and Asia-Pacific. The short and spot trade is actually about 20% per annum. That equates to that growth there. So even with relatively slow growth in the future, if China's slowing down and some other things happen, in the next 10 years, the Asia-Pacific market is likely to be as big as the current global market. And so there's still additional LNG needed. And as I mentioned, some of the older projects are now coming off. They're declining. So in order to meet that, quite a few projects are needed to come online. Lots in the US are waiting, but they're not all going to be US projects. There's projects in Australia, potentially projects in Canada, potentially projects in East Africa and elsewhere. And I think one of the things I would stress is that each project is unique. And although we talk, and you very often hear analysts talking about Australian projects being expensive. You see it in the Canadian press as well. How can Canada compete with anybody? And even now in the US, they're starting to say, oh, these projects are looking too expensive under current conditions. That's all fine, but each individual project is unique, and it's going to be up to the participants in those projects to make them work. Again, that's where the ingenuity and the innovation will come in. So, what does it mean for Australia? Well, looking at it on a greenfields perspective, LNG from Australia probably is a little bit expensive in terms of new projects coming forward. But that's probably not true for mature projects and for brownfields expansion of projects. As we've seen in the US, if you've already got existing infrastructure, you have an advantage because you don't have to pay for all that. We also have that proximity to Asia advantage, and as a result, we will become the largest producer of LNG. How long that lasts, I don't know. It might be a couple of years, it might be 10 years, it might be forever, who knows? I doubt that, actually. But also, that production from those current investments, or those investments that are coming to fruition now, will need further development. So, the Northwest Shelf, recently NRB was commissioned, was that 2 years ago? That was a $4 billion project. There's yet more development to come on the Northwest Shelf venture to keep the engines running, to keep the LNG being produced. So these projects aren't build it and then just run it. It's build it and then build something else to keep filling it and build something else to keep filling it. So there's an awful lot of work to be done just to keep those projects going. As I mentioned, greenfield projects will need robust price. Well, they will need robust pricing because they are going to be expensive, and that's going to require this ingenuity. And each project is unique. That's something that, so as you get into project work, people will be trying to find ways to make their project go ahead. It would be remiss of me to leave this, because I am sort of coming to a close now, without talking about FLNG. But I'm not going to talk about it directly. What I'd like to do is just take you back history to something else. FPSs, floating production systems, FPSOs and other sort of floating oil production systems these are. So back in the early 70s, new technology, nothing had been built. Pioneers building the first one. The first one was a converted drill ship. The second one was the first FPSO as we know it now, which was a converted tanker in about 1976. I have to admit to being alive then, so I was there. But I was only a youngster then. And then through the 80s and 90s, slow development. This is when I graduated. And then by the time we're up here, it's run-of-the-mill. FPSOs, everybody does it. I think that's what's going to happen to FLNG. Okay? Now, this on its own, you'd say, wow, it's a bit of a stretch, isn't it, going from oil to FLNG? They're a bit of a different beast. But a lot of the issues that FPSOs faced are the same as what FLNG is facing. And in addition, I'm going to take you back to that LNG short-term market because I think FLNG and the LNG short-term market go together. The reason is that FLNG will be focused on developing smaller pools of gas, and therefore they won't want to be signing up to 15 or 20-year gas contracts. They'll be wanting to sign up to shorter contracts. And I think the development of the short-term market and the development of FLNG projects will go hand in hand. The short-term market has followed a very similar pattern to the development of floating production systems. In addition, we have another view, FRSUs, floating regasification and storage units, which are like the other end of the scale. So when the LNG gets to wherever it's going and it's up for regasification, again, historically it's been done by land-based You pump it into storage tanks on land, and then it gets regasified and put into the distribution system and used as normal. Back in the early 2000s, everyone said, well, we can convert LNG carriers to do that, convert them into regasification units that will sit in a port somewhere. There's one in Teesside, just a bit further south of Newcastle, and they're popping up all over the world. So in the last 10 years, that appears to be following the same trajectory as well. That's why I think FLNG will go there. We're sat here now. So if we're sat here now, 10, 20, 30 years' time, I don't know whether there'll be 300, but there may well be hundreds operational by then. That's a career. You know, if you're coming out of university now, there's a career in this industry for you, and a good one. And that's pretty much it. Most of the projects that are coming on stream in Australia, as of this year, will still be operational when you retire, when you're older than my boss. Sorry, Pete. And therefore, there's a lot of work out there. There will be a lot of work out there. I am having a great time. Don't know whether I will in the morning now after a comment like that, but it's a good industry to work with. I've travelled the world, met my wife, and done some really interesting things. So I think there's demand. There's room for more projects out there. We need people to develop and run those projects. And it's going to require engineers. Engineers. That's my view. That's what I think. I don't think we need to do this again because you were all favourable before, weren't you? So you can have another go. If I've turned you off, tell me. You know, it's... Yeah, not a lot different, was it really? So, yeah. And again, I don't think we need to do that one, so I'll click through that one. Thank you all very much for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions now, or I doubt there's any beer left, is there? I would have thought, but if there is, over a glass.
Can I start with a question?
Yes, of course,
you?
yeah.
Subsea Engineering. So we've seen you plot the potential future for FLNG. What about subsea? Is the processing plant going to ever sit in the seabed? Is that a direction for the future?
I think people think that, yes, and it certainly has potential. Obviously, subsea engineering has come a long way, again, even in my career. I came out when it was not usual to have subsea wells and flow lines and all this. So, and I've seen people developing subsea separation technology, subsea compression systems. In my time in Shell, I remember looking at subsea compression systems. So there's definitely a lot of effort being put into that arena. I guess I have a residual question as to whether it's valuable, whether it's more valuable. You know, the art of putting something above on the sea surface that you can get at and touch and interfere with may be good, may be bad. So I certainly think there's definitely more development to happen in subsea engineering. Whether it will be, you know, complete process systems on the seabed, I don't know. What do you think?
I'm responsible for introducing subsea engineering onto the campus, so there's only one answer.
Yeah, well, good, because it's innovative. And I think the more the better. All of these things start off as being new and odd, and someone has to actually take a risk. Shell have taken a risk with Prelude. There's other people out there as well. There's actually 5 sanctioned projects out there at the moment doing FLNG. They're all a little bit different. So FLNG is already different for different people. And I think the same with subsea. You know, different people have been trying different techniques. I know Shell's canned compressor was a huge beast. But I know other people are looking at it in different ways. And I'm sure someone at some point will make a breakthrough that.
Questions, comments from the audience?
Thanks for your presentation, Mark. Just a comment, and I'm interested to hear your views on the US as an exporter. And a lot has been made of the US's potential growth as an exporter, but at the moment it's largely unproven. Given that their development is very different to what we've seen in Australia in the sense that it's largely shale gas, and the environmental challenges around shale gas, and the environmental opposition around shale gas. How do you see the US development going, and do you think it will reach the heights that it is being touted to achieve?
I think just maybe breaking that question up into a couple of parts. The shale gas issue is not as large in the US as it is elsewhere in the world. Obviously, they've been doing it for a while. They clearly have developed their techniques quite a long way, and they've reduced the costs involved in developing shale gas. So to the extent that I think people have been surprised at the lack of impact on US production from the reduction in oil price. What's happened is the rig count has gone, being cut dramatically, but they're actually concentrating on the good production areas at the moment. So you're not seeing that knock-on impact in terms of reduced production as much as you are in terms of reduced activity. Now, there'll be a balancing point, I think, in terms of pricing, and that's the interesting bit for me. So I think definitely they're going to be a significant exporter. That's already on the cards because they've got 50 million tonnes sanctioned. How much bigger that gets, I think, will be dependent on a couple of things. One is, will significant quantities of export gas have an impact on the local gas price? Because if that does happen, and if the US Henry Hub and other hub prices do start to rise, then the advantage to Asia and Europe of importing US LNG sort of goes away. And that will dampen demand and potentially dampen the enthusiasm for building yet more export terminals. The other bit is whether their cost basis will increase as a result of having, well, I think it was 7 up there, wasn't it? So it's about the same as we've seen in Australia, 7 projects ongoing at the same time. If they now sanction more, it will be, more and more. And yes, their skills and resource base is bigger in terms of building things, but it's not unlimited. The LNG industry is a global industry anyway, so everybody's targeting the same manufacturers and the same people to do the work. So there will come a time when they face those same issues of cost increases and delays and schedule problems. Yes, I think they're going to export more. They'll either be number 1, 2, or 3. I don't know in terms of what order of magnitude. I think your guess is as good as mine on that one. I don't know if that really answers your question or not. But
I guess I'm looking at it in terms of the requirement to drill more and more wells to maintain production, and the effect that over time is going to have on the industry, on the popularity, the acceptability of the industry as they tend to do.
Yeah, and like I said, I think time will tell on that one. Certainly the impact on production hasn't been as marked as people 12 months ago would have anticipated. I think there was certainly a view 12 months ago that if the prices drop and stay low at that sort of $60 a barrel. There's so much production in the US that can't make money at that level, that you'll see a decline. That didn't happen. And I think it's partly because they've started to concentrate on the sweet spots and they've improved their techniques. So there is clearly a sort of range of areas within the US. Some can cope with low oil prices, some can cope with medium oil prices, and some with higher oil prices. And I think, again, within the last 2 weeks, there's been a few articles out there now suggesting that the US shale industry may be the swing producer that OPEC has been in terms of oil and maybe gas production. And I do see that there's a link between oil and gas as well there that is not obvious, I think, because there's this hysteresis that's a matter of years, I think, in the system between oil prices impacting gas prices and impacting activity in both areas. And it's particularly prevalent in the US, where they'll switch from drilling dry oil, liquids rich, to no, don't drill any gas, we'll drill oil instead, as those prices fluctuate. They're very quick to react in the US, much quicker than anyone else can, I think, apart from maybe the Saudis.
Comments? Questions?
I'm not an expert, so I'm going to ask the question. These capital expenditure projects, as they come into production, are they going to be affected by the lower LNG prices, or have they locked in prices for their customers for the next X number of years?
Most of them, it depends what you say locked in. They have locked in prices, but most of them will be oil linked. So they are affected by the rise and fall of the oil price, yes. So they will be looking down the barrel of lower oil prices and therefore lower LNG prices than they were anticipating 12 months ago, yeah. And that obviously has an impact on your return on investment and the time it takes to repay your capital and all that sort of thing, yes. So I don't think there are any projects out there that have got fixed prices, as in terms of it's X dollars per million BTU or per gigajoule. They're all indexed to something. One at the back, yeah.
This lady has been.
Yeah, I'll be loud enough. Russia, because I'm not from the industry, but Russia is under this political pressure. The economy is not the best, and it's close, at least the borders. I don't know where gas fields are. They are close to India, China, quite a few countries that are important importers of gas. And the falling oil price as well, which puts additional pressure on Russia. Because in your presentation, which I found very interesting, Russia was not deemed to be a major player, not one of the most important players. Are there expectations that Russia will have a more dominant role in the future? Because they are under pressure, and if they have gas, at least they could improve the economy. And I know that Mr. Putin, he is going out to China or India to become more friendly with those countries.
Yeah, and sorry, it wasn't meant to give the impression that Russia's not a big player, of course. But most of the Russian gas is sold through pipeline systems. And they've done some, they've had letters of agreement recently with the Chinese for pipelines into China. There's lots of pipelines through Eastern Europe into Western Europe. It's just that, I guess in this one we were looking at Australian LNG, and so the graphs are more about LNG exporters and importers rather than gas generally. The LNG market is only about 25% of the natural gas market in total. So it's a growing part of the natural gas market. And so as gas in general is growing, LNG is growing at a faster rate. Now, whether that's going to continue or not, I think does depend on things like how do people interact with Russia and other major gas holders in terms of getting pipeline gas into their countries as well. So I think Russia will have a major influence on where things go, but most of their focus is really on pipeline gas, not LNG. They've got LNG projects coming through the loop as well, but not on the same scale at the moment. At the moment, I'd say, yeah.
Can we have just a final question?
Yeah. What we seem to be witnessing in the world at the moment is a titanic struggle between the Saudis and the Americans to gain market share. How close are the Saudis to achieving their objective, and how sustainable is it?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that one. I wouldn't pretend to know the sort of machinations of either the Saudi or the US authorities in terms of what they might or might not be trying to do. I think the article that resonated most with me recently was this one about the fact that the US has now decreased its drilling costs and its production cost in terms of the shale oil and shale gas. That there is this ability to switch on and off in terms of production, almost, because they just say, oh, that drilling rig's laid off, and then 6 months later they can call it back into operation. They're hot stacking lots of rigs at the moment and concentrating on the areas where they can get most bang for their buck. Now, that means that they have a swing potential that is nearly as big, if not bigger, than the Saudis have at the moment. So I don't know where that's going to go, other than my personal opinion would be that oil price isn't going to go very much higher in the near future. I don't think we're going to see the $100 plus per barrel that people sort of got used to as little as 2 or 3 years ago. I think we're going to see a relatively sustained period of what I would call reasonable oil prices. And in fact, I hope that's what we see, because in my lifetime, we've had a few recessions and global crises and all this sort of stuff. They always seem to have been predicated or preempted by a spike in oil prices. It happened in the 70s, it happened in the 80s, it happened in the 2000s. And so conversely, and I may be a little bit off whack with this, but my perverse nature says, well, if we've got a sustained period of low oil prices, that actually should be good for the global economy. It should stimulate other things and other areas and other businesses to get going. I hope it does that. And well, that is true, and I agree. There's already evidence that the oil usage is going up because of the lower oil price. Certainly, the EIA came out last week, I think, and said that the last 6 months' increase has been something that they haven't seen for 15 or 20 years. And yes, that comes with an environmental impact. Yeah. So I agree. There's a caveat on it.
Thank you, Martin. I think we better close off the evening here. Thank you very much for an